The moment my attorney slid the folder across the table, my ex-husband's lawyer stopped mid-sentence. Not slowly, not gradually, he just stopped. Martin had been smiling all morning, that kind of smile men wear when they think they already know how something ends. He'd worn it through the parking lot, through the elevator, through the first 40 minutes of the hearing. His attorney, a polished man named Clifford, had that same comfortable energy, the kind that comes from representing someone who believes, genuinely believes, that the other person has nothing. I sat across from them with my hands folded in my lap and said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's the only power you have left. And sometimes, on the right morning in the right room, it's the most devastating thing you can bring to a table. I need to back up. Because none of this makes sense without the part that came before it. And the part that came before it was 22 years of a marriage that looked, from the outside, like something worth keeping. Martin and I met in 1999. He was finishing a master's in business administration at Georgetown. I was passing through the city between assignments, staying with a college friend named Becca for 3 weeks, and we met at a dinner party where someone had made too much pasta and not enough sense. Martin was funny. Sharp. He had a way of listening to you that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. I was 31. I thought I knew what I was doing. We got married in 2001, in a small ceremony in Virginia. My parents came. His parents came. Becca was my maid of honor. Martin gave a toast that made 3 people cry. What Martin did not know, what I had not yet told him, because we had only been together for 14 months, and because some things take time, was that I had spent the previous 9 years working for the federal government in a capacity that was not, and could not be, fully explained over dinner. I was a federal agent. Specifically, I was a special agent with the FBI's counterintelligence division. I had joined at 22, straight out of college, following a path that had been shaped by a professor who saw something in me I hadn't yet seen in myself. I spent 2 years at Quantico, then 3 years working domestic surveillance operations out of a field office in Chicago, then 4 years on a joint task force that I am still, to this day, legally prohibited from describing in detail. I had a cover story. Everyone in my position has a cover story. Mine was that I worked in federal compliance. Essentially a glorified paper pusher for a mid-level government contractor. It was boring enough that most people stopped asking. Martin, to his credit, asked more than most. But I had been trained to answer questions, and I answered his the way I had been trained. By the time we married, I had told him I worked in government administration. I told him I traveled sometimes for work. I told him my hours were unpredictable and my phone might sometimes go silent for days. He said he understood. He did not understand, but I believed he was trying to, and for a while that was enough. The early years were good. We bought a house in Alexandria. Martin built his consulting firm. I continued my work, which by 2004 had transitioned into a supervisory role that kept me closer to home. Closer but not always present. We had our daughter June in 2005. Then our son Owen in 2007. I was the parent who showed up. I made it to school plays and soccer games and pediatrician appointments more on than Martin did, because Martin was building something, and building required weekends and late nights, and the particular self-importance of men who equate ambition with absence. I did not resent him for it. I had my own ambitions. I had my own absences, but somewhere in the years between 2007 and 2014, something shifted. Martin's firm grew. He started traveling more. He started coming home to a house he seemed to be visiting rather than living in. And he started slowly, and then all at once, treating me like someone who needed to be explained rather than understood. It started small. A comment at a dinner party. Eleanor works in federal paperwork. She'd be the first to tell you it's not exactly thrilling, said with a laugh, his hand on my shoulder, his eyes looking past me at whoever he was trying to impress. Then bigger. A conversation with his mother, overheard from the hallway, in which he described me as someone who had never really had a career, not in the real sense. I stood in that hallway for a long moment. Then I went back to the kitchen and finished making coffee and did not say a word. This was 2015. I had been with the FBI for over 2 decades. I had been awarded the FBI Director's Award for Excellence. I had worked operations that were later, in heavily redacted form, referenced in congressional briefings. My name appeared in documents that were classified at levels most people don't know exist. But I made good coffee, and I kept a clean house. And to Martin's mother and eventually to Martin, I was the woman who had never really done anything. I retired from the Bureau in 2017. 31 years of federal service, and I walked out of a building in Washington with a handshake, a plaque, and a security badge that was immediately collected. I had not told Martin the full scope of what I was leaving behind. I had told him I was wrapping up my government work. He had nodded and said, "Good, maybe you'll finally have time for things." I remember looking at him across the kitchen table and thinking, he has no idea, not in a dramatic way, not with anger. Just the quiet recognition that I had become, in this man's mind, someone small. We lasted another 4 years. The marriage didn't end in a fight or an affair or a dramatic revelation. It ended the way most things do, gradually and then all at once. Martin came to me in November 2021 and said he thought we'd grown apart. He said he wasn't happy. He said he'd been speaking with an attorney. He said it with the same polished ease he used in boardrooms. I said, "Okay." He blinked. I don't think he expected that. I said, "I'll find my own attorney." He almost looked disappointed that I wasn't going to argue. The attorney I found was a woman named Patricia. No, I need to use her real name because she earned it. Her name was Harriet Vance, and she had been practicing family law in Virginia for 30 years. She wore sensible shoes and had a way of looking at you over her glasses that made you feel simultaneously seen and measured. I sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon in December and told her everything, not everything, but enough. I told her about the career. I told her about the retirement benefits. I told her about the pension, the federal compensation structure, the deferred accounts. I told her about the years Martin had spent building his firm while I had quietly, invisibly contributed to a household that allowed him to do so. Harriet listened without interrupting. Then she asked 2 questions. The first was logistical. The second was, does he know about all of it? I said, no. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a smile. Good, she said. Let's keep it that way for now. Martin hired Clifford Ashworth, whose name I recognized from a profile in a Virginia legal publication about high-asset divorce cases. Clifford's approach, which became clear within the first round of filings, was to position Martin as the primary breadwinner of the marriage. The builder, the earner, the one who had made the lifestyle possible, and to position me as someone who had been, essentially, supported. It was not a dishonest argument, exactly. Martin had earned considerably more than I had in our final decade of marriage. His firm had grown, he had assets. What Clifford did not know, what Martin had apparently not thought to mention, or perhaps did not know in enough detail to mention, was the structure of a federal law enforcement pension, or the spousal contribution provisions in the retirement accounts I'd been quietly building since 1990. Or the fact that a 31-year career with the federal government produces a retirement benefit that does not look, on paper, like anything Martin's attorney had been planning around. Harriet filed the documents. Clifford asked for a continuance. Then he asked for another one. The morning of the actual hearing, I arrived 20 minutes early. I wore the same gray blazer I had worn to 3 different congressional briefings in the 1990s. It still fit. I sat down, folded my hands, and watched Martin walk in with Clifford beside him. Martin looked at me across the room and smiled. That comfortable smile. The one that meant I have this. His attorney started talking about assets. About Martin's contributions to the marital estate. About the consulting firm's valuation, the investment accounts, the beach house in the Outer Banks that Martin's parents had helped them buy in 2010. I sat and listened. Harriet, beside me, was very still. At the appropriate moment, when Clifford had finished his opening and the mediator asked if we had anything to add, Harriet said, "Yes, we'd like to enter into the record documentation related to Mrs. Whitmore's federal service and associated retirement benefits." She opened the folder. Inside was a summary document, not classified. Nothing I could bring into a civilian proceeding was classified, but it didn't need to be classified to be significant. It was a clean, factual summary of 31 years of federal service, the GS pay grades, the pension calculation, the survivor benefit elections, the deferred compensation accounts, the years of service multiplier. Numbers that Clifford, focused entirely on Martin's side of the ledger, had never looked for. Also inside was my retirement letter, which listed my final title, which was Special Agent in Charge. Martin frowned. Not the comfortable frown of someone encountering a minor inconvenience. The frown of someone who has, for the first time, looked across a room and realized they do not know who they are looking at. Clifford set down his pen. The mediator looked up from the document, then at me, then back at the document. I did not say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. The numbers said it. The title said it. 31 years of a career that Martin had spent 20 years summarizing as Eleanor's government paperwork was sitting there on a table in 12 pages of federal documentation, and all I had to do was let it sit. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where people expect triumph, and I don't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I feel when I think back to that morning is something quieter and harder to name, something close to grief maybe, because the look on Martin's face, the frown, the recalibration, the moment when his whole understanding of our marriage shifted. That look did not make me happy. It made me tired. It made me think of all the dinners where I had smiled through comments I didn't correct. All the parties where I had stood next to Martin while he introduced me with a kind of apologetic pride. The way you introduce something that is fine but not impressive. All the years I had been careful, professionally and personally, about what I revealed and what I protected, and how that careful, patient, deliberate invisibility had been interpreted by the man who shared my home as smallness. Not once did he ask. Not once in 22 years did he sit across from me and say, "Tell me what you actually do. Tell me what you can tell me. Tell me who you actually are," he assumed. And then he stopped even doing that. June called me that evening. Our daughter June, who was 19 and in her second year at UVA and had been watching this whole process from a careful distance, she said, "Mom, Becca told me what happened today." I said, "I know, honey." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you always know it would turn out like this?" I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I said, "I knew who I was. That part I always knew." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite crying. Then she said, "He really had no idea, did he?" "No," I said. "He didn't. Do you think he would have treated you differently if he'd known?" That's the question I've been sitting with ever since. Maybe. Maybe not. Some people, when they look at a woman, will only ever see what they expect to see, and no amount of documentation changes the architecture of their assumptions. But here is what I know. I spent 31 years in service to this country. I worked operations that I will never be able to talk about. I made calls that kept people safe. I trained agents who are still in the field. I built a career that was, by any measure, significant. And I built it while also raising 2 children and maintaining a home, and being whenever I could be present. I did not need Martin to know all of that. I had never needed him to know all of it. Some of it couldn't be known, and some of it I had simply chosen not to offer to someone who had never thought to ask. But I needed him not to assume. I needed him not to look at me across 22 years of shared life and conclude without asking that I was less than what he was. That was the thing I couldn't give him. Not his assumptions. Not his comfortable certainties. Not the version of me he'd built in his head out of absence and indifference. Owen called 2 days later. My son Owen, who was 17 and living with me during the week, and who had, in the way of teenage boys, processed most of this by going very quiet and then asking for pancakes. He sat at the kitchen counter on a Saturday morning while I made breakfast and said, without looking up from his phone, "Dad texted me." I said, "Okay. He said you had a bunch of stuff he didn't know about." I turned from the stove. "What did you say back?" Owen looked up. He has his father's eyes and my stubbornness, which is a combination I've always found equal parts exhausting and quietly wonderful. I said, "Yeah, Dad, that's kind of the whole point." I laughed. Actually laughed for the first time in weeks. He went back to his phone. "Are you okay?" he said in the tone of someone who is asking more than they're letting on. "Yeah," I said, "I really am, and I meant it. Not because anything had been restored, not because Martin had apologized, he hadn't and I wasn't waiting. But because I had walked into that room, and I had let the truth sit on the table, and I had waited, and the waiting had been the whole point. The settlement took another 3 months. Harriet was thorough, Clifford was chastened. Martin was, according to Becca, who heard it through a mutual friend, not handling it well, which I registered with something between sympathy and indifference. The federal pension division was calculated correctly. The deferred accounts were addressed. The beach house went to Martin. I didn't want it. I had never particularly liked the Outer Banks. I got the house in Alexandria, and my retirement, and my name back on documents that were mine to begin with. I turned 57 that April. June came home from school for the weekend. Owen made a cake from a box mix, and somehow managed to burn the edges while leaving the center raw. which is an achievement I still don't fully understand. Becca flew in from Denver. We sat in the backyard on a warm Saturday afternoon, and nobody talked about the divorce or the hearing or Martin or any of it. At one point, Becca looked at me and said, "You know, you've never actually told me everything you did. In all those years." I said, "I know. Are you ever going to?" I smiled. Some of it's still classified. She rolled her eyes in the way she's been rolling her eyes at me since 1991, and June laughed, and Owen ate a second piece of raw cake, and the afternoon light came through the oak trees in the backyard, at the angle it always does in April in Virginia. There was nothing dramatic about it. No music swell, no perfect closing line. Just an ordinary afternoon with people I loved, in a house I'd kept, at the end of a chapter I'd gotten through. I've thought a lot about what I would say if someone asked me what the lesson was, what the takeaway is, and I keep coming back to the same thing, which is not particularly elegant but feels true. You do not owe anyone the full version of who you are. Not your credentials, not your history, not the shape of the life you built before they arrived. Some of it is yours to keep. But the people who love you, the real ones, will ask, they will want to know. They will sit across from you and see that there is more and say, tell me what you can." I'm not going anywhere. Martin never asked. That, in the end, was the document that mattered most. Not pension summary, not the title on the retirement letter. Just the absence of a question he never thought to ask.